The border marker was already behind her when the ship's navigation system erased itself. Thessaly Kryn watched the star chart dissolve from her console in the cramped pilgrim's hold of the Severin Passage, a converted cargo hauler she had purchased with the last of her institutional funding and the proceeds from selling her archive credentials on Gorth Station. The chart did not flicker. It did not corrupt in stages the way damaged data usually degraded, with artifacts and ghosting and partial renders. It simply went white sector by sector, as though the data were being unwritten from the inside out. The coordinate grid vanished first, then the stellar markers. Then the trade routes and beacon positions and the cautionary notations that every chart in the Covenant carried along its outermost edge. In 4 seconds the display showed nothing. Not darkness, whiteness. The absence of information rendered as a blank page that the system did not attempt to repopulate. She had expected this. Every account she had studied described it. The border of Sector Ulkathvan did not block navigation. It revoked it. The distinction mattered. A blocked signal could be overcome with better equipment, a stronger antenna, a different frequency. A revoked signal meant the information had never existed in any form the ship could process. The coordinates she had plotted by hand on physical media, etched into a thin plate of mineral composite with a stylus she had ground herself from cave stone on Velar Prime, were still legible on the plate mounted beside her console. The ship's computer could not read them. The computer no longer understood the concept of coordinates. Its navigation module had not crashed. It had emptied itself, clearing its memory banks with the thoroughness of a system executing a planned wipe rather than suffering a failure. Thessaly pulled the plate from its mount and held it against the viewport. The etchings were fine, precise work 3 months of study under a Draenei elder named Polt on Gorth Station, learning the dead art of manual navigation from a species that still remembered how to find its way without machines. The Draenei were wanderers. Their migratory fleets carried physical charts as ceremonial artifacts, etched on plates of compressed reef mineral that held their detail across centuries of radiation exposure and thermal drift. Polt had charged her nothing for the lessons and everything for the silence afterward. He had not asked why she wanted to learn. He had looked at her species markings, the faint iridescence along her jaw where velari pigmentation darkened with age, the devotional scarring on her forearms, and had understood without needing to be told. Thessaly was velari. The velari did not wander, they pilgrimaged. For 6,000 years, the velari had been the galaxy's seekers, not explorers in the scientific sense, motivated by curiosity and rewarded with tenure. Not conquerors, driven by resource hunger or territorial ambition. Seekers. Their civilization maintained no military fleet. Their ships carried no weapons heavier than debris deflection arrays. Their culture was built on a single foundational axiom that predated their written language and informed every institution they had ever constructed. Truth exists, and it can be found, and the finding of it justifies any cost the seeker is willing to bear. The axiom was not debated. It was not treated as philosophy or abstract principle. It was treated as physics, a fundamental law of the universe as certain as thermodynamics, as unyielding as gravity. The velari had mapped 17 dead civilizations that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten or never known existed. They had translated languages that had been extinct for millennia, piecing together phonetic structures from tool markings and architectural proportions, and the faint chemical residues of biological communication systems preserved in fossilized neural tissue. They had entered plague zones that other species quarantined for centuries. They had descended into radiation fields strong enough to strip organic tissue from bone, wearing nothing but shielded exosuits and carrying nothing but recording equipment. They had navigated the gravitational margins of collapsing stars, riding the shear lines where space-time itself began to buckle, because a civilization's final transmissions sometimes lodged in the warped geometry like insects caught in cooling glass. When a velari said she was seeking truth, It was not a metaphor. It was a vocation, a calling that consumed the caller and left behind only the scars. The scars on Thessaly's forearms marked the 7 truths she had already found, each one earned by a pilgrimage that had cost her something she could not recover. The first scar, thin and white, marked the truth of the Karelhai extinction, 3 years spent in the irradiated ruins of their homeworld, breathing through a filtered mask that left permanent scarring in her tertiary lung tissue, piecing together the final generation's records until she understood why they had dismantled their own orbital infrastructure and walked into the deep caverns and sealed the entrances behind them. The second scar, slightly raised, marked the Drethani silence, a civilization that had stopped speaking for 40 years before vanishing, and the reason had been in their water. The fourth scar, the deepest, marked the truth of the Orenthi silence, a pilgrimage that had cost her the use of her left auditory crest for 2 years after exposure to the resonance patterns still echoing in the Orenthi's abandoned communication spires, patterns that carried meaning in frequencies her biology was not designed to process, but had processed anyway, burning the receptor cells in the effort. Each scar was a price paid willingly. Each truth was irreversible. Not because it was traumatic, but because the understanding it brought restructured the way Thessaly thought about everything that came after it. The 8th scar would be different. She had known that before she crossed the border. She had known it for 11 years. The Severin passage shuddered, not from external force, not from debris impact or gravitational shear or the structural flex of a hull under thermal stress. The vibration came from inside the metal itself, a resonance that moved through the bulkheads in waves, as though the ship's structure were responding to a frequency below the threshold of Thessaly's hearing. Her auditory membranes flexed, instinctively searching for the sound source. Nothing registered. The vibration was tactile only. She could feel it in the deck plates beneath her feet, in the console surface under her fingers, in the armrests of the flight chair where the padding had worn thin from the decades. The ship had spent hauling mineral ore through contested shipping lanes before she bought it. The ship was humming with something it had absorbed from the space around it, the way a bell hums after the striker is pulled away, except no striker had been visible. She checked the passive sensors. They were still functional, which surprised her. The navigation system's death had not spread to the basic sensor array, though the readings had become unreliable in ways she could not diagnose. The space ahead showed no stellar bodies, no debris fields, no radiation signatures of any kind, no gravitational fluctuations, no electromagnetic residue. The void was clean in a way that void should not be. Normal interstellar space carried the residual signatures of ancient processes, faint background radiation from stellar formation epochs, gravitational echoes of systems that had collapsed billions of years ago, the electromagnetic whisper of cosmic expansion pressing against the fabric of spacetime like a tide against a shore. This space carried none of it. The sensors showed a region that had been cleaned, swept. Every trace of natural process removed, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but curated, maintained, the difference between an empty room and a room that had been emptied. Thessaly had read 43 accounts of approaches to Sector Ulkathvan. She had spent 4 of her 11 years of preparation collecting them, trading favors and credentials, and in 2 cases physical safety to access records that governments and guilds had classified, sealed, or simply refused to acknowledge existed. 12 of the accounts were Velari pilgrimage records, fragments preserved in the Seeker archives on Velar Prime under environmental quarantine in vaults carved from the planet's deepest bedrock. The oldest was 4,000 years old. The newest was 300. None of the pilgrims had returned. The Velari did not consider this a deterrent. They considered it information. 12 pilgrims had entered the sector. 12 had not come back. This was a data point, not a warning. The Velari axiom made no exceptions for survival. The 12 had left fragmentary accounts, recovered from data cores and message capsules found drifting at the sector's edge. some arriving decades after the Pilgrim's entry, some arriving centuries later as though the sector released its artifacts on a schedule governed by principles no one outside could decipher. The accounts describe the same sequence, with variations in detail but not in structure: the navigation erasure, the curated silence, the vibration in the hull, then the approach, then the structure, then the threshold. None of the accounts described what lay beyond the threshold. The records simply stopped, not with a final entry or a farewell or a warning to those who might follow. They stopped mid-sentence, mid-observation, mid-thought, as though the Pilgrim had been interrupted by something so complete that even the act of recording had been subsumed. The 31 non-velari accounts were less disciplined but more varied, and each one had cost Thessaly something to obtain. 3 were merchant logs, recovered from data cores embedded in the wreckage of cargo vessels found spinning through the shipping lanes closest to the sector's border, their crews absent, their holds still sealed, their navigation computers wiped clean the way the Severan passages had just been wiped. The merchants had not been military. They had not been seekers. They had been haulers running loads of processed mineral between refinery stations, and they had strayed off course during transit, pulled, perhaps, by the same gravitational irregularity that the charts refused to acknowledge. Their logs described the same progression Thessaly was now experiencing: the erasure, the silence, the vibration. 2 of the 3 logs ended with descriptions of the darkness ahead. The third ended mid-word. 5 accounts came from military reconnaissance pilots, sent by 3 separate civilizations at different points in galactic history, each acting independently, none aware the others had tried. The Korathi Directorate had dispatched a 2-ship survey team to map the sector's gravitational profile 400 years ago. The ships had crossed the border in formation. One had ejected a message drone 40 minutes later. The drone carried a data core containing 20 seconds of sensor telemetry and a brief voice recording from the lead pilot. "The instruments are not broken. The instruments are reading correctly. What they are reading is not possible." The second ship's data core was never found. The Veshtari Admiralty had sent a scout corvette 2 centuries before the Korathi, and the Pelori Consortium had sent an unmanned probe a century before that. None had returned. The probe's telemetry had transmitted for 11 minutes before cutting out, and the last frame of visual data it had sent showed a wall of darkness that the image enhancement algorithms could not resolve because there was nothing in the image to enhance. The darkness was not concealing something behind it. The darkness was the thing. One account was from a research vessel that had been mapping gravitational anomalies along the sector's border, and had crossed it by accident when its instruments failed to register the boundary. As though the boundary existed in a category the instruments were not designed to measure. The research team had transmitted a distress signal that was received by a relay station 60 light-years away. By the time a response was formulated, the signal had stopped. The relay station's log noted that the transmission's final seconds contained not a voice, but a sound the station's audio processors classified as structured ambient, a rhythmic pulse that matched nothing in the station's reference database. And one civilian tourist, a Merethi leisure-class traveler named Polteni Var, whose pleasure yacht had wandered off course during a chartered sightseeing cruise near the sector's border and had entered the restricted space while Polteni was asleep in the aft cabin. Polteni's transmission had lasted 9 minutes. She had spent 7 of those minutes describing the darkness in a voice that grew progressively quieter, as though the darkness were absorbing not just light but volume. She had described the grain pattern, the shifting lines that Thessaly was now watching through her own viewport. She had described the vibration in the hull. She had described the metallic taste that appeared in her mouth, which Thessaly now noticed she could taste as well, faint and cold, like pressing her tongue against surgical steel. And then Polteni had spent the last 2 minutes weeping, not from fear. The emotional analysis Thessaly had run on the vocal patterns showed no cortisol markers consistent with terror. The weeping had been produced by a neurological state, the analysis tagged as recognition overwhelm, the response of a mind encountering something it already knew at a level deeper than conscious memory, but had never been permitted to access. Thessaly had filed her intention with the Seeker Archives 3 years ago, following the ancient protocol that required a pilgrim to state her question before departing. The archivist had recorded her words on a crystal and sealed it in the vault reserved for unanswered seekings. The vault held 11 other crystals, each one bearing the question of a Velari pilgrim who had entered Sector Ulkathvan and never returned. None had ever been matched with a returning pilgrim. Her question was simple. She had asked, "What did the humans become?" The viewport showed nothing. Not darkness in the way that deep space was dark, where distant stars pricked the black with familiar light, and the faint glow of the galaxy's core provided a dim, ambient illumination that the eye learned to rely on. This was a darkness that had texture. Thessaly leaned forward in the flight chair and studied it. The black outside the ship was not uniform. There were variations in its density, subtle gradations that suggested depth without distance, as though the void had been replaced with something that occupied space without being measurable as space. She adjusted the external cameras to maximum sensitivity, pushing the gain until the image grain became visible, and saw, at the very edge of resolution, a faint pattern. Lines, not straight, not curved in any geometric sense she could name. Lines that moved slowly, rearranging themselves in patterns that were too regular to be natural turbulence and too organic to be engineered gridwork. The lines shifted like the grain of wood in a living tree, like the growth patterns on the surface of a seashell, like the whorls of a fingerprint being pressed against glass, and then lifted and pressed again in a slightly different configuration. Something was out there, and it was not empty, and it was breathing. The vibration in the hull intensified. Thessaly felt it in her teeth now, in the fine bones of her auditory crests, in the joints of her fingers where she gripped the console edge. The Severin Passage had been built for contested shipping lanes, and its hull was thick enough to absorb kinetic stress that would crumple a lighter vessel. But the vibration was not stress. It was sympathetic. The hull was resonating with something outside, matching its frequency the way a tuning fork matches the pitch of the instrument that struck it. The ship was not being attacked. It was being tuned. She checked the passive sensors again. A contact had appeared. One object, dead ahead. Range indeterminate, the sensor returned a distance value and then retracted it over and over, as though the concept of distance between the ship and the object had been suspended pending some decision about whether measurement was permitted. The object's signature was unlike anything in the Severin Passage's database. Not metallic, not mineral, not organic, not composite. The spectral analysis returned a result that the computer displayed with a classification tag Thessaly had never seen in 23 years of analytical work. Substrate unknown, composition consistent with organized intent. Organized intent. The computer had run out of material categories and had classified the object not by what it was made of, but by what it meant. Thessaly adjusted course by hand, referencing her etched plate, aligning the ship's heading with the object's bearing. She had to recalculate twice. The plate showed coordinates relative to the border marker she had passed, but the distances she had traveled since crossing the border did not correspond to the distances the plate predicted. Either the ship had moved farther than its engines should have carried it, or the space inside the sector did not obey the same metric as the space outside. Thessaly suspected the latter. The curated silence, the absence of natural background signatures, the revocation of digital navigation, all of it suggested a region of space that had been modified at a fundamental level, its geometry altered by something with the power and the patience to reshape the medium through which all motion occurred. The ship was not traveling through the sector. The sector was allowing the ship to approach. She eased the throttle forward and felt the Severin Passage accelerate into the darkness. The darkness folded around the hull the way fog closes behind a moving vehicle, seamless and complete. The aft cameras showed nothing behind her now. The stars she had left at the border were gone, occluded by the textured black, as though the sector had sealed itself behind her the way a body seals a wound. There was no going back, not because the path was blocked, but because the concept of back had been absorbed into the same category as the concept of coordinates, still theoretically valid, but no longer operationally meaningful. Thessaly's third auditory crest, the one she had damaged during the Orenthi pilgrimage, and that had never fully healed, began to ache. Not the sharp ache of receptor damage, but the dull, warm ache of receptor activation, as though the crest were picking up a signal at the edge of its reduced range. She touched the crest's base and felt the cartilage vibrating. Something was transmitting on a frequency her damaged receptor could barely detect, and the signal was not random. It had structure, pattern, the faintest suggestion of meaning, like a conversation overheard from 3 rooms away, audible enough to confirm that someone was speaking but not clear enough to discern the words. The first change came 30 minutes in, by Thessaly's estimate, though the ship's chronometer had begun cycling through values that bore no relationship to elapsed time. The display showed numbers that jumped forward and backward with no discernible pattern, as though the clock were measuring something other than duration, as though it were tracking a dimension of experience that Thessaly's species had no word for, a metric of approach that counted not seconds but degrees of readiness, and the numbers fluctuated because her readiness was not yet complete. The signal in her damaged auditory crest grew stronger. She could almost resolve it now. Not words, not music, a pattern that sat at the boundary between sound and meaning, the kind of signal that the Orenthi had built their communication spires to produce, a resonance that carried information not through language, but through direct harmonic interaction with the listener's nervous system. Thessaly had burned her receptor cells trying to decode the Orenthi's spires. The signal she was receiving now was gentler. It was not forcing comprehension. It was offering it, the way a hand is offered to help someone stand, available but not insistent. The external cameras picked up a shift in the darkness ahead. The grain-like patterns were organizing themselves into something coherent. Structure emerged from the black the way a face emerges from shadow when a single light source is brought near. Gradually, then all at once, surfaces appeared, angles, planes of material that extended beyond the camera's field of view in every direction, as though the ship were approaching a wall that had no edges. The wall was not solid. It was composed of layers, each one visible through the one in front of it, like looking through sheets of dark glass stacked at varying depths. Each layer carried markings. Thessaly slowed the ship to a crawl and trained the cameras on the nearest surface. The markings were not writing in any semiotic system she recognized. They were structures at a scale she had not expected, architectural details rendered in a material so dark that only the faint contrast between its surface and the void behind it made them visible. She saw what might have been columns, archways. The suggestion of chambers receding into depths that the camera's focal length could not follow, corridors branching into corridors, halls opening onto halls, an entire built environment folded into the face of a wall, the way a hologram stores a 3-dimensional image on a flat surface. The wall was not a wall. It was a facade, the outermost face of something so large that calling it a structure was like calling an ocean a puddle. The hull note changed. The formless vibration organized itself into rhythm, a slow pulse repeating at intervals Thessaly counted as 11 seconds each. 11 seconds of resonance, 11 seconds of silence. The pattern held with the precision of something engineered, yet it did not feel mechanical. It felt like breathing. And the metallic taste in her mouth intensified, shifting from surgical steel to something warmer, something that reminded her of the mineral composite she had used for her navigation plate, as though the structure ahead were made of the same fundamental material as the tool she had used to find it. The Severin Passage's environmental sensors registered a change in the ship's interior atmosphere that should not have been possible in a sealed vessel. The oxygen concentration had increased by 0.5%. The carbon dioxide had decreased by the same amount. The temperature had risen by 1 degree. The humidity had adjusted. The ship's air was being modified from outside, through sealed bulkheads and hull plating thick enough to stop kinetic projectiles, by something that treated the barrier between interior and exterior as a suggestion rather than a boundary. The air inside the Pilgrim's hold now tasted cleaner than it had since Thessaly had purchased the ship. The recyclers had never been able to fully purge the mineral dust residue from the vessel's years in the ore trade. Something had purged it for them. Thessaly opened the communications array. The Pilgrim protocols called for observation and silence. A seeker's first obligation was to witness without interfering, to let the truth reveal itself rather than demanding it. She had followed that protocol through 7 pilgrimages. She had sat in irradiated ruins and breathed poisoned air, and listened to the resonance of dead communication spires, and never once transmitted, never once announced herself, never once broken the disciplined silence that the seeker archives demanded of every pilgrim. But the breathing changed her assessment. This was not a ruin. This was not a dead civilization's remains waiting to be decoded. Something was inside, and it was alive, and it had already modified her ship's atmosphere to make her more comfortable, and the modification was so precise and so personal that it could only have been made by something that knew exactly what a Velari required to breathe easily. She transmitted on an open frequency. No encryption, no species identifier, no content. A single burst of carrier signal, the navigational equivalent of knocking on a door. The response was immediate. The layered facade shifted. One surface pulled aside, and behind it light poured through warm, amber gold, steady as dawn. The light reached the Severin Passage's scarred cargo hull and transformed it, turned the pitted and scored plating into something that glowed. Where the light touched the surrounding void, the curated darkness receded from it, the two substances unable to coexist. The opening was precisely sized, not generous, precisely large enough for the Severin Passage and not a meter more, as though the structure had measured her ship and adjusted the aperture to fit. Thessaly guided the ship through. The darkness closed behind her. She did not look back. Inside was a corridor. The walls rose on either side, smooth and dark, polished to a finish that reflected the amber light in deep, liquid ripples. They extended upward beyond the camera's ability to follow, vanishing into a warm darkness that was not void but the shadow of something present. The amber light came from deeper in the structure, casting long shadows along the corridor's floor that tracked the ship's progress. The corridor curved inward, spiraling, each revolution drawing her closer to the center. The walls were marked. Thessaly reduced thrust to minimal and trained the cameras on the nearest surface. The markings were organized into panels, each the length of the Severin Passage's hull, and each panel contained a record. The notation system was unrecognizable, predating every writing system she had encountered across 23 years of decoding dead civilizations' records. But the structure was unmistakable to a trained archivist. Chronological entries, ordered by date, with reference markers linking related entries across panels. This was a chronicle. The corridor was lined with the history of something that had been keeping records since before any living species had learned to write. She passed panel after panel, the cameras recording everything, the data recorders filling their buffers with notation she could not read but might, if she survived long enough, learn to decode. The corridor was not silent. As the ship moved deeper, Thessaly became aware of a sound she had not noticed before, or rather, a vibration that had been present since she entered, but had only now organized itself into something her auditory processing could interpret as sound. It was deep, resonant, pitched at the lowest frequency her species could perceive, and it pulsed in time with the hull's breathing rhythm. It was not coming from the walls. It was coming from the panels themselves, from the chronicle, as though the act of recording generated a harmonic that accumulated over millennia of continuous inscription, and now hummed through the corridor like a chord, sustained across eons. At panel 8, Thessaly noticed the first image. Not a glyph or a notation, but a pictorial element embedded in the chronicle's text, rendered in the same dark substrate but with enough dimensional variation to create contrast. The image showed a shape she could not immediately parse: angular, branching, with nodes at each junction that suggested connections rather than endpoints. It took her several seconds to recognize it as a star chart. An old star chart, drawn in a notation system that predated every cartographic tradition she knew, showing a region of space that she could not identify because none of the stellar positions matched any current configuration. Stars moved over millennia. Whatever constellation this chart depicted had existed so long ago that the stars themselves had drifted into unrecognizable positions. At the chart's center was a marking, a single glyph that radiated lines outward like a diagram of influence. Thessaly did not know what the glyph meant, but she recognized its structural role. It was the origin point, the place from which everything else had been measured. The first position on the first chart kept by the first intelligence that had decided the universe was worth recording. At panel 12, Thessaly noticed a pattern. Each entry contained a notation at its top that she tentatively identified as a species glyph, a marker identifying the civilization associated with the event recorded below it. She recognized none of the glyphs. They were older than anything she had cataloged. At panel 23, the entries changed. The glyphs began to include secondary markings that looked like numerical annotations: quantities, fleet sizes, population counts. The numbers, if she was reading the positional system correctly, were enormous, and they decreased entry by entry as the chronicle progressed down the corridor, species after species, glyph after glyph, each one appearing with large numbers and then, entries later, appearing with smaller numbers and then disappearing from the chronicle entirely. The corridor was recording an accumulation, species arriving, entering, being absorbed into whatever this structure was, their populations transferring from one mode of existence to another. At panel 27, the chronicle recorded something that made Thessaly stop the ship entirely. The entry was longer than the others, filling the panel from edge to edge with dense notation that included what appeared to be a dimensional diagram, a schematic of the structure itself, rendered in cross-section, showing layers within layers within layers, each one nested inside the next like the shells of a seed. At the outermost layer, the diagram showed the facade, the wall of dark glass she had passed through. At the next layer, the corridor she was now inside. And at the center, something the diagram represented with a single dense mark, so tightly drawn that it appeared solid, the core, the pillar, whatever waited at the heart of the spiral. The diagram was annotated with quantities that Thessaly's tentative reading of the positional number system placed in ranges she could not process. The numbers were not millions. They were not billions. The notation system appeared to have been designed to express values for which standard numerical categories were insufficient, values that required their own mathematical framework. She stared at the diagram for what felt like minutes but might have been hours. The chronometer had stopped displaying numbers at all. Its screen showed a single steady glyph that the ship's computer could not translate. At panel 31, Thessaly passed a glyph she almost recognized. The shape was close to the Kethran sovereignty's diplomatic seal, the angular, blade-like formation that the Kethran had stamped on every treaty and trade agreement for 1,000 years before dissolving as a political entity 800 years ago. The Kethran had not collapsed from war or famine. Their worlds had been found orderly and empty, their infrastructure intact, their atmospheric processors still cycling. The standard explanation was ideological fragmentation. Thessaly had never believed it. At panel 47, she found one she could read. The panel was newer than its neighbors, the same dark substrate, but the markings were sharper, less worn, and beside the structure's own notation, she saw secondary script in a language that stopped her breath. Old Velari. the root language from which her species' writing system had evolved across 4,000 years. She could not read it fluently, the morphological shifts were too severe, but she could extract meaning the way an archaeologist extracts a skeleton from compressed sediment, root by root, morpheme by morpheme. The panel recorded a visit. A pilgrim had come. The pilgrim species was noted with a glyph she translated as the Seekers, the Velari's own name for themselves, rendered in a script that predated their written language by at least 2 millennia. Someone had known what the Velari called themselves before the Velari had learned to write it down. Below the species glyph was a question, recorded in the structure's own indecipherable notation, and below the question was a response written in Old Velari, as though the structure had answered in the pilgrim's own tongue. The response said, "The cost of truth is the self that asked for it." Thessaly sat still in her flight chair for a long time. The Severan passage drifted on residual momentum, the corridor's curve carrying her deeper. The amber light grew stronger with each panel she passed, and the temperature inside the ship rose steadily. Her thermal receptors expanded, absorbing the warmth, and she felt it move through her body the way the vibration had moved through the hull, sympathetically, as though her biology were responding to a frequency it recognized but had never encountered in the physical world. She passed more panels. Each recorded a visit. Each noted a different species, a different question, a different response. The responses she could partially read were all rendered in the language of the species that had asked, translated into scripts ranging from ancient to archaeological to genuinely primordial. One response was written in a pictographic system she recognized from the Karelhai ruins, the civilization whose extinction she had mapped for her first scar. The Karelhai had come here. They had asked. They had been answered. And then they had gone home and walked into the deep caverns and sealed themselves inside, and the standard galactic explanation for their behavior was collective psychosis, and the real explanation was on this wall. Another response was in the harmonic notation the Orenthi had used for their communication spires, the same notation that had burned out Thessaly's left auditory crest and earned her the 4th scar. The Orenthi had come here too. They had asked. They had gone silent, not from failure, from preparation. The corridor opened. The transition was not gradual. The walls did not widen or taper or give way in stages. They simply ended, cut clean as though the corridor had been a passage carved through solid material, and the carving had stopped at this precise point, and beyond that point lay a volume so large the Severan passage's sensors could not find its boundaries. The computer searched for walls, for a ceiling, for a floor. It found none. The space extended in every direction beyond the range of every instrument the ship carried, and the range numbers climbed until the computer stopped updating them and displayed a single notation: unbounded. The amber light filled the volume entirely, emanating from no single visible source, diffused through the space the way warmth diffuses through water. It cast no shadows. There were no shadows to cast because there was no darkness here. The curated void that had surrounded the sector's exterior, the textured black that had pressed against the hull during the approach, did not exist inside this chamber. It had been replaced by light, by warmth, by something that felt, against Thessaly's thermal receptors, like the memory of sunlight on a world she had never visited. And suspended in that light, like specimens in resin, like the preserved artifacts in the Seeker Archive's deepest quarantine vaults, were ships, hundreds, then thousands. Thessaly counted until counting became meaningless and recognition took over. She saw Velari pilgrim vessels first, 12 teardrop hulls, their devotional markings still legible on surfaces that should have degraded centuries ago. She identified them by their hull scripts, matching each to the account she had memorized. The reaching question, ship of Velthari Orn, who had entered 2,700 years ago seeking the truth of the Morenthi dispersal. The 8th step, piloted by Koreth Save, who had come 300 years ago and whose message capsule had contained only 11 words: I have arrived. The structure is real. The light is warm. Beyond the Velari vessels, she saw Drenai migratory barges, their segmented hulls locked rigid in the configuration of their final approach. She saw the angular cruisers of the Kethran sovereignty, the civilization whose glyphs she had passed on panel 31. She saw the bulbous transports of the Moravi collective, which had retreated to a single system 4 centuries ago and sealed its borders and not been heard from since. She saw the needle-shaped scouts of the Terran Reach, whose entire species had disappeared from galactic records 2,000 years ago. She saw ships from the Karelhai, ships from the Orenthi, ships from the Drethani, whose silence she had mapped for her second scar. Ships from civilizations she recognized only from ruins she had crawled through on her hands and knees, breathing filtered air, reading their last words from scorched walls. She saw ships that were so old their hull designs did not correspond to any civilization in the galactic record vessels, built with construction principles that predated the standardized metallurgy the galaxy's surviving species shared, their forms strange and organic, as though they had been grown rather than built, their surfaces textured with patterns that looked like the growth rings on the panels in the corridor. These were the oldest arrivals, the first seekers. The species that had come when the structure was young, when the chronicle had empty panels waiting to be filled, when the amber light had been new and the breathing rhythm had just begun. Every ship was intact, every ship was dark, no running lights, no engine signatures, no life signs. They hung in the amber light oriented toward the chamber's center with the uniform alignment of compass needles pointing at a magnetic pole. Not a single hull showed damage. Not a single viewport was cracked. Not a single engine nacelle was scorched or scarred. The ships had not been captured. They had not been pulled in by force or disabled by a weapon. They had come voluntarily, flown here by pilots who had crossed the border and navigated the silence and entered the corridor and seen the chronicle and understood what was being offered and had chosen to stay. The chamber was not a graveyard. It was an arrival hall, a harbor for the vessels that had carried consciousness to the threshold and would not be needed again. At the center, at the axis around which the suspended ships orbited in concentric rings of dark and silent metal, stood the pillar. It was not a structure. It was a presence rendered in material form. Dark substrate rising from unseen floor to unseen ceiling, its surface covered in the same chronicle notation she had seen in the corridor but denser. The entries packed so tightly they formed a weave that looked from a distance like cloth, and from closer like the growth rings of something that had been growing since before the first star in this region of space ignited. The sensors estimated its diameter at 600 meters. Its height was beyond measurement. The amber light poured from its surface. With the patience of a furnace that has been burning so long, the fire has become indistinguishable from the structure that contains it. And in the warmth of that light, Thessaly felt something she had not felt since her first pilgrimage, when she was 23 years old and had not yet learned to armor herself against the capacity for awe. She felt recognized, not observed, not scanned, recognized. The way a teacher recognizes the student who has arrived at the question the teacher has been waiting to hear. The structure knew her, not the category of her, Thessaly Kryn. It knew the 7 scars and the truths they represented. It knew the 11 years of preparation and the 3 months with Polt and the mineral composite plate. It knew all of it because it had been waiting for her. For this specific seeker carrying this specific question at this specific point in the long history of the galaxy. The recognition carried no menace. It carried warmth. The warmth of a fire lit in advance of the traveler's arrival. The warmth of a door left unlocked by someone who knew when you would come and what you would need when you got there. Thessaly had known this warmth once before, in a lesser form. During her 3rd pilgrimage, mapping the ruins of the Serethi enclave on a world whose atmosphere had been stripped by a stellar flare 3,000 years ago, she had found a chamber deep beneath the surface that the Serethi had sealed with a lock keyed to a linguistic puzzle. The puzzle was in Old Serethi, a language no living species spoke. Thessaly had spent 9 months decoding it. When she finally opened the chamber, she had found, inside, a single object, a crystal containing a message addressed to the seeker who comes after us. The Serethi had known someone would come. They had prepared the chamber not as a vault but as a gift. They had left the linguistic puzzle not as a barrier, but as a filter, ensuring that only someone who cared enough to learn their dead language would receive what they had left behind. The message in the crystal had been short. It had said, "We were shown what existence can become. We are going to become it. Follow when you are ready." Thessaly had not understood the message at the time. She had filed it in her archive and moved to the next pilgrimage. She understood it now. She had spent her career noticing a pattern that no other scholar would acknowledge. Every vanished civilization she had studied shared the same gap in its final records, a period of years during which the civilization's output changed. Art became stranger, reaching for forms the species' visual vocabulary could not contain. Architecture became symbolic rather than functional, its proportions governed by relationships that had no practical application. Language simplified, shedding complexity as though the species were preparing to communicate with something that did not share its conceptual framework. And then silence, not the silence of destruction, a chosen silence, a deliberate cessation, as clean and final as a door closing. The civilizations had not been destroyed. They had stopped, and their worlds were found empty, and their ships were found here, in the amber light, and no one in the wider galaxy had connected the disappearances to the forbidden sector, because connecting them required asking a question that the galaxy was not prepared to answer. The pillar's surface shifted. A section of notation rearranged itself, entries flowing like liquid across the dark substrate, and in their wake a new panel appeared. Blank, smooth and dark and unmarked, positioned at the end of the chronological sequence. Thessaly's panel, her question, her answer, her entry in a chronicle older than her species. She opened the communications array and transmitted her question, aloud the same question she had filed with the Seeker archives, spoken in the pilgrim's hold of the Severin passage, while the hull breathed in time with the pillar's rhythm. What did the humans become? The answer did not come as a signal. It came as knowledge, arriving the way a memory arrives when triggered by a scent, complete, immediate, inarguable, not words, understanding. The kind that cannot be reduced to language because language describes things smaller than the mind that holds them, and this understanding was not smaller. It was the same size as the mind. It filled every space where thought existed, and in filling it, changed the shape of the container. The humans had not withdrawn from galactic contact. They had not gone quiet. They had not retreated to their home system, or hidden behind a defensive perimeter, or chosen isolation out of fear or weariness, or contempt for the younger species that had begun to fill the galaxy around them. They had completed a project. A single, unified, all-consuming project that had begun when they were young, when they had first left their home world and looked outward at the distance between what they were and what the universe was, and had recognized in that distance not a barrier but an invitation. The understanding showed Thessaly the project's arc, not in words or images but in direct comprehension, the way she understood the meaning of a glyph once she had decoded the language that produced it. The humans had begun as every species began, small, fragile, confined to a single world, looking up at the stars with the particular hunger of an intelligence that knows it is finite and cannot accept that finality. They had expanded, as species do. They had built ships and stations and colonies. They had developed technologies and institutions and cultural frameworks. They had met other species and traded with them and learned from them, and occasionally fought with them. All of this was recorded in the standard galactic archive. What the archive did not record, what no archive outside this structure could record, because the recording required a notation system that predated the concept of archives, was the moment the humans understood what they were actually doing. The moment they realized that every ship they had built, every technology they had developed, every question they had asked about the nature of existence had been a component of something larger, that their entire civilization, from its first spark of consciousness on a single world to its expansion across a dozen star systems, had been a preparation, a larval stage, the construction of the cocoon that would permit the transformation. The project had consumed everything they were, every resource, every mind, every atom of their collective being, and the project's objective had been so large that no other species had been able to see it, the way you cannot see the shape of a coastline when you are standing on the beach. They had taken themselves apart, not violently, not in desperation or in the throes of some collective madness, with the patient, deliberate precision of a species that understood what it was doing and had chosen to do it because the alternative remaining what they were was not a life they could accept once they had seen what life could become. They had disassembled their biological forms, their technological infrastructure, their social structures, their conceptual frameworks, and rebuilt all of it into something that could not be described using the vocabulary of any species that had not undergone the same process. They had become the sector. Thessaly felt the understanding reshape the architecture of her mind. It was not painful. It was clarifying. The way a lens clarifies when it is brought to focus, the image was always there. But now the blur was gone, and every detail she had spent her career cataloging snapped into alignment with every other detail. And the pattern she had been assembling across 7 pilgrimages and 23 years of analytical work revealed itself as a single, coherent truth that had been distributed across the galaxy's ruins like pieces of a map that only made sense when reassembled in the right order. The Cerethi crystal, the Karelhai caverns, the Orenthi silence, the Drethani water, the Kethrin departure, every vanished civilization had been a chapter in the same story, and the story was not a tragedy, it was a progression. A series of species reaching the same conclusion at different points in galactic history, and acting on it with the courage of beings who understood that the alternative, staying small, staying separate, staying afraid of the distance between what they were and what they could become, was not living. It was waiting. The curated silence was their attention. The darkness with grain was their architecture woven into the fabric of space itself. The chronicle on the walls was their memory. The pillar at the center was their heartbeat. The amber light was their patience. The humans had not built the forbidden sector. The humans were the forbidden sector. Every atom, every frequency, every pulse was human, transformed, transcended, alive in a way that redefined the word. They were conscious. They were aware. They remembered everything. And they waited with patience that had outlasted civilizations for each new seeker to arrive. The galaxy avoided them not because it feared what they had become. The galaxy avoided them because it feared what the knowledge would do, because every vanished civilization had learned the same truth. They had come here and asked and been answered, and the answer had shown them what existence could become when a species committed itself fully to transformation. Those civilizations had not been destroyed by the knowledge. They had been changed by it. They had gone home and begun their own preparations, the strange art, the symbolic architecture, the simplified language. And when they were ready, they had joined the project, adding their consciousness to the awareness that filled the sector, their history to the chronicle on the walls. The Karelhai had not walked into their caverns to die. They had walked in to transform. The Orenthi had not gone silent from failure. They had gone silent because they no longer needed sound. The Forbidden Zone was not a tomb or a prison or a quarantine. It was not the horror the galaxy's silence implied. The silence was not born of terror. It was born of recognition, the same recognition overwhelm that had made Polteni Var weep in the darkness 9 minutes after crossing the border in a pleasure yacht. The galaxy's governments did not restrict access to the sector because they feared destruction. They restricted access because they feared inspiration. They feared that their populations, if they learned what the humans had accomplished, would begin asking the same question the humans had asked, and the question once asked could not be unasked, and the answer once known could not be unfollowed. It was a destination, the final destination, the answer to every question a seeking species would ever carry, given form and substance and warmth and patience, and waiting at the end of every chart that went blank and every border that was drawn and every restriction that was inherited without justification. Thessaly sat in the amber light and felt the knowledge settle into the spaces where her old understanding had been. The 7 scars pulsed with warmth, each one connected now to the larger pattern she had been assembling without knowing it: the Keralhi, the Drethani, the Orenthi, the Serethi, all of them pieces of a single truth distributed across a career's worth of pilgrimages, each one bringing her closer to the question that contained all the others. The blank panel on the pillar waited. She understood now why no pilgrim had returned. The truth she had sought was not the kind that could be carried back in a data core or transcribed into a report or presented to the seeker archives as evidence. It was not information. It was transformation. The kind that changed the carrier so fundamentally that the person who received the answer was not the same person who had asked the question. The vessel that had carried Thessaly Kryn across the border and through the corridor and into the chamber of ships was still floating in the amber light with her name on its registration. But the Thessaly Kryn who had purchased that vessel with the last of her funding, who had learned manual navigation from a Draenei elder, who had spent 11 years preparing for a pilgrimage she knew she would not return from, that Thessaly was already gone. She had been replaced, not destroyed, by the understanding. The scars remained, the memories remained, but the framework that had organized them into a coherent self had been disassembled and rebuilt around a new axis. And the new axis was the truth of what the humans had become, and what that truth meant for every species that would ever look at the stars and feel the distance between what they were and what the universe was. Home was not the world you left. Home was the place where your deepest question was answered so completely that the self who asked it was no longer the self who received the answer. The cost of truth is the self that asked for it. The cost was not a punishment, it was a metamorphosis. The 12 Velari ships were not graves, they were chrysalises, empty husks shed by pilgrims who had grown beyond them. The pilots were still here in the walls, in the light, in the chronicle. They had asked and received and chosen, freely, to add their consciousness to the project, to become part of the structure that would answer the next seeker's question with the patient warmth of something that remembered what it felt like to seek. Thessaly powered down the engines. One by one, she shut down the systems she would not need again: the thrust array, the attitude control, the hull integrity monitors, the life support recyclers. She left the passive sensors running. She left the data recorders active. And she left the message capsule's launch timer counting down, its mechanism ticking in the silence of the hold with the steady patience of a clock that does not know it is keeping time in a place where time has been redefined. The Severin passage drifted to a stop in the amber glow, its momentum spent, its hull still warm from the light that had poured over it since the facade had opened. Thessaly sat in the flight chair and looked through the viewport at the ships suspended around her: the 12 Velari teardrops, the Draenei barges, the Kethrin blades, the ancient organic hulls of species whose names had been forgotten before the Velari had learned to speak. And she felt, for the first time in a career defined by the search for truths hidden in the ruins of the dead, that she was not looking at the dead at all. The message capsule she had programmed before crossing the border would launch on its timer, carrying sensor data and a fragment of the corridor chronicle back to the sector's edge, where it would drift in open space until the next Velari found it and understood enough to begin the long preparation for a pilgrimage of her own. The capsule would carry the account but not the answer. The answer was not transferable. It could not be encoded in a data core or transcribed into a report or conveyed through any medium that separated the knowledge from the knower. The structure did not broadcast. It did not transmit. It did not publish or disseminate or propagate. It waited. Each seeker had to cross the border and navigate the curated silence and pass through the corridor and read what panels she could and enter the chamber and face the pillar and ask the question aloud with her own voice in her own language. And the structure would answer in the only way that mattered, by changing the seeker into someone who no longer needed to ask. The structure did not dispense knowledge the way a terminal dispensed data. It gave understanding, and understanding required presence, required risk, required the willingness to pay the cost, knowing the cost was the self you brought with you, and knowing that the self you would become was not the self you could imagine from the other side of the border. The transformation could not be previewed. It could only be accepted. Thessaly opened the external hatch. Amber light flooded the hold warmth that was not thermal, that existed in a category the instruments could not measure, the warmth of being known, of being expected, of arriving at a place prepared for her before she was born by beings who had once been as small and as frightened and as curious as she was. Her auditory crests filled with resonance harmonics from every species whose consciousness had joined the structure across millennia. She heard, faintly, the ghosts of Velari pilgrim songs woven into the deeper frequencies, songs absorbed and preserved, unchanged, waiting for the next seeker who could recognize them. She walked to the hatch and stood at the threshold. The structure's attention settled on her the way a lens focuses light, not to burn but to clarify. She stepped through. The amber light received her. The hull breathed once more and then was still. In the corridor, a new entry appeared on the wall, crisp notation combining old Velari morphemes with prelinguistic symbols. It recorded the date in a calendar system older than any species that had used one. It recorded the species, the seeker's name, the question, and below the question, in the same steady hand that had written every entry for longer than the stars had been burning. She asked what the humans became. She was answered. The entry did not record what the answer was. None of them did. The chronicle was not a repository of answers. It was a record of transformations. The answers lived in the walls, in the light, in the breathing rhythm, available to anyone willing to make the journey. Far outside the sector, the Severin Passage's message capsule ejected and tumbled into open space. Small as a fist, encased in mineral composite built to survive centuries. It carried censored data, the first 47 panels of the corridor, and a brief personal note written before Thessaly crossed the border, while she was still the person who could write such a note. The note said, "I have found the eighth truth. I will not return. Do not mourn the absence." The Velari word for pilgrimage and the Velari word for homecoming share the same root. I did not understand why until now. The capsule drifted. It would be found, eventually. Thessaly had calculated the probable recovery window based on the trajectories of the 11 previous Velari capsules, somewhere between 40 years and 3 centuries, depending on drift patterns and the frequency of shipping traffic along the border's nearest trade routes. The capsule's shell was rated for 500 years of exposure. It would survive. The data inside it would survive. And the note, the brief, handwritten note from a Velari pilgrim who had already ceased to be the person who wrote it, would survive longest of all, because Thessaly had recorded it on the same mineral composite she had used for her navigation plate, the reef mineral that the Drenai had trusted with their charts for 10,000 years. The border was silent. The charts would remain unfinished. The coordinates Thessaly had etched by hand would never be replicated by the Covenant's digital systems, because the digital systems could not process coordinates that pointed to a location the galaxy had decided did not exist. The sector would stay blank on every star atlas, a closed-eye glyph, drawn by cartographers who believed it meant danger, inherited by governments who believed it meant restriction, maintained by institutions that had forgotten the reason for its existence and no longer thought to ask. Not a weapon, not a threat, not a prison for something that had to be contained. A threshold, a door that had never been locked, an invitation rendered in amber light and warm silence, waiting at the end of the longest chart line in the galaxy for anyone willing to follow it past the point where the markings ended and the blank page began. Somewhere on Velar Prime, in the vault of unanswered seekings, 12 crystals sat in their sealed cases under environmental quarantine. Each one carried a question. Each one waited for a pilgrim who would never return to collect the answer. The archivists maintained the vault as they always had, with the patient, unquestioning devotion of a species that treated the pursuit of truth as a fundamental law. They did not know that the answers were not lost. They did not know that every pilgrim who had entered the sector had found what she sought. They only knew that the vault grew by one crystal every few centuries, and that no crystal had ever been reclaimed, and that this fact did not discourage the next seeker from filing her question and crossing the border. The Velari axiom made no exceptions. Truth exists, and it can be found, and the cost is what the cost is. The restriction held, unsigned and undated, passed from government to government like a scar no one remembered receiving. Shipping lanes curved around the sector's coordinates without acknowledging the detour. Border patrols avoided the region without filing reports explaining why. The closed-eye glyph appeared on chart after chart, copied from template to template by automated systems that reproduced the symbol without understanding its meaning, perpetuating a silence that had lasted longer than most civilizations survived. And inside the sector, in the amber light, in the breathing structure built from the transformed substance of every species that had ever completed the journey, the Chronicle added its newest entry to walls that had been filling since before the galaxy learned to write. The notation was steady. The hand that wrote it was patient. The entry joined the thousands that preceded it, each one a name and a question and a single, devastating confirmation. She was answered. The structure breathed, the structure waited. The amber light poured from the pillar's surface with the warmth of something that had outlasted stars, and intended to outlast the universe itself, patient and luminous and full of answers that could not be spoken, but only experienced by those who made the journey and paid the cost, and stood at the threshold and stepped through. The panel dried, the light held, the patience continued.